Welcome to this lesson on postmodernism. In this lesson, we will be looking at a critical school and a philosophical theory called postmodernism, but also a cultural practice, and explore some notions of the postmodern, as well as look at examples of postmodernism in art and culture. Postmodernism is a school of thought in philosophy and in critical theory, which rejects the opposition between high and low culture, which sees the art films of Satyajit Ray and the films of Karan Johar as more or less the same thing. It also rejects the claim of any universal or totalizing theory and believes that knowledge, power are not absolutes. They are also interested, postmodernists are also interested in local histories, little stories, rather than grand narratives of history. It's also extremely skeptical about the so-called truth, as in truth with a capital T. The first module focuses on the origins of postmodern thought. It is usually believed that the publication of Jean-Francois Lyotard's book, The Postmodern Condition, the French original work appeared in 1979 and the English translation in 1984, is treated as the first moments of postmodern thinking in philosophy. Please remember, it originates in philosophy. The book was subtitled A Report on Knowledge. It was a project commissioned by the Government of Canada to talk about and analyze the state of university education and the question of what constitutes knowledge. Lyotard's book had several things to say about knowledge, but that is module 2. So let me not go there as of this point in time. However, contemporary readers, especially literary critics and cultural critics, have discovered notions, concepts and the playfulness of the postmodern in much earlier texts. The preeminent text in this case is Laurence Sterne's 18th century English novel Tristram Shandy. Postmodern forms of thought have also originated within media, and the cultural critic Jean Baudrillard is notably taken as the prophet of postmodernism. Postmodernism has also influenced the work of the psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan, the post-structuralist thinker Jacques Derrida, the historian of ideas Michel Foucault. Through the 90s, Deleuze and Guattari and several others have also been identified as postmodern. So as we can see, the real origins of postmodernism are a bit difficult to pin down. We can think of Lyotard's text as giving us the primary text in philosophy, but the postmodern tendencies to these ones predate Lyotard's own book. This is something we need to keep in mind. Postmodernism believes that knowledge is always going to be fragmentary and incomplete. You cannot step outside the system to understand the system. We can always only know a part of the truth. As a result, postmodernism refuses to believe in any kind of absolute truth, as in truth with a capital T. There cannot be a universal, global, acceptable to everyone kind of truth, because knowledge is, like truth, always partial, fragmentary and uneven. It also proposes that because we are limited creatures in terms of cognition and recognition, we cannot always know the entire truth. So there is always the point that, or the problem that, truth is more than always partial, never complete. In literary studies and cultural theory, this has resulted in several interesting modes of reading. We now no more speak of a final reading of a text. We do not say that this poem or that novel has only these meanings. We now speak about the plurality of meanings, the multiplicities of meaning, and the openness of a text. What does postmodernism's openness of a text mean? The openness of a text means a text is open to multiple readings. Since we are limited creatures, we can only access a small component, a fragment of that text. We cannot know the text in its entirety. The partial nature of knowledge means we can only always know a text in partial ways. Other points about knowledge are also equally significant. Traditionally, we believe that only certain kind of texts give us knowledge. Postmodernism rejects this idea. Postmodernism argues that high culture as well as low culture offer us forms of knowledge, modes of thinking. That is, knowledge is not the domain of high culture alone. You needn't see only certain kinds of films or read certain kinds of books for knowledge. Popular forms also give us knowledge. This means, and this is a very important political point, postmodernism argues that knowledge is not inherent in a text. It does not reside in a text. It's how we read it that produces knowledge. This also implies knowledge is intimately connected with power. So, the final point under postmodernism and knowledge is precisely this. Knowledge is something elites seek to control. Knowledge is something institutions mandate, control and legitimize. Knowledge is not something democratically open. Knowledge is not something everybody has access to. More importantly, what you possess need not be knowledge till the institution says so. What postmodernism is effectively saying is, knowledge is controlled very tightly because knowledge is what constitutes power. It has larger consequences, this line of argument. It suggests that knowledge is something that is restricted to certain members of the society, to certain classes, and it's kept tightly controlled because the release of knowledge means the chance of people not believing their leaders are very high. The control of knowledge is what postmodernism resists. It argues that knowledge must be open, equally shared, acceptable and accessible to everyone. You will see a parallel to this in contemporary digital and internet cultures where we speak about open source, where texts, books, art forms are all available for all of us. Open source and open access is something that you can readily associate with the postmodern condition because it refuses to give authority to a set of people. The best example is what you are all surely already familiar with, the Wikipedia. Put together by people like you and me, not necessarily by professors, institutions and banks and people in power. The entire structure of the Wikipedia is user generated. So this means effectively that the control over knowledge is not in the hands of a few but democratically spread out. This is postmodernism at its best. Finally, postmodernism's emphasis on knowledge includes a fair amount of playfulness. It believes that the old idea of knowledge being associated with serious actions and serious activities was primarily a class thing. It was restricted to certain classes and was not accessible to members of all kinds of people in society. Postmodernism and the hyperreal. Let's take the example of the Mona Lisa painting or the face of Che, the South American revolutionary. Has anybody seen the original painting? The answer is very few of us have seen the original painting. But yet we all recognize it. How is this possible? We have not visited the museum where the original exists. However, we all recognize the painting because it has been endlessly duplicated. It exists in the form of copies for all of us to see, understand, admire, appreciate. Postmodernism argues that in the age of reproduction of the photocopy kind, of the stimulation kind, of the simulation kind, the question of the original is not relevant anymore. There is no original because we, as in you and I, common people, will never know the original. Has anybody here seen Che? No. But then we all recognize Che because he's on t-shirts, he's on caps, he's on posters. Films are made about him. For us, the copy is itself the original. The French philosopher Baudrillard coined the term hyperreal to speak of a condition, a postmodern condition, where some of us will never know the original, we will only know the copy. The copy is all there is in the age of reproduction of the electronic and the digital kind. What is also important is when we say it is for us the original, the distinction between the original and the copy has broken down. There is no original for us. We will never know the original. The copy is real enough. Now, think about this problem. What Baudrillard calls simulation is the effect of the real. What do we mean by this? Since we will anyway not know the Mona Lisa as painted by Da Vinci in this highly guarded museum, for us the copy is good enough. For us the copy is real enough. Simulation is the significance, the real for us. It's the value we attach to a copy as though it were the original, and this is important. Simulation is the value we attach to any object of art as though it were real. Naturally, this leads to some particular consequences, this line of argument. Baudrillard also argues that the age of the hyperreal is the age of the sign. When we buy a product, we are not buying only the product, we are buying a sign value. For example, advertisements on TV which tell you that if you use a particular toothpaste, you become more attractive as a person. You are not buying a toothpaste, you are buying the value associated with the toothpaste. What you are doing is to believe and buy the image of the attractive person because he or she uses a toothpaste. In this whole issue of consumption, the toothpaste is the least important. What is more important is the image you have. Oh yes, this makes me more attractive. This makes me more interesting. What we are talking about is packaging and advertising which sells you, and this is important, so please think about it carefully. The advertising or the packaging sells you not the product but the idea behind the product, the story behind the product. This is what we refer to as the hyperreal consumer cultural condition. We consume a sign, we consume a story. We do not consume a commodity only as commodity. There is no such thing as a pure commodity anymore. That is the age of postmodern consumption, and you only have to look at amusement parks or brands being advertised on television to understand what we are talking about here. At no point do we ever think of tea as tea or toothpaste as toothpaste, right? We most often think of toothpaste as giving us a particular look, producing a certain effect, whether it's the Axe perfume or whether it's a particular kind of toothpaste or whether it's a particular brand of footwear. We are not talking about footwear and shoes and perfumes. We are talking about the values you and I associate with it. That's postmodern replication. That is the age of the sign. It's not the product, but the sign that is important. Let me now go on to module 4, which is about the more interesting and perhaps complicated philosophical issue, and that is the question of postmodern selves. What is the self in the age of the postmodern? You will recall that I have already proposed that postmodernism destroys the idea of a total, of the unity. It emphasizes the fragmented, the partial. Postmodern philosophers propose that we will know ourselves only through a set of discourses and image. What do we mean by this? I can only know myself through a set of narratives about myself. Medicine offers a narrative. The human body is this, this and this. Philosophy offers a set of ideas about myself. Literature offers something about myself. Art, psychology and psychiatry. What we are speaking about here is, it's impossible to think of us as in human selves outside the language in which we can talk about ourselves. So if I were to say, I am so and so, I belong to a particular department, and let me pause here with an example that I began with, or rather the introduction I began with. I identified myself as a member of the English faculty of the University of Hyderabad. Now for you to know who I am, what I do, you need that label. Oh, he is a teacher of English from the University of Hyderabad. Now, for you to know me, you need that example, you need that description. You know me through that description. Likewise, if you want to look at yourself, you require a set of discourses. What we are talking about here in postmodernism is, postmodernism believes that the self, that the sense of identity, the knowledge of who I am, comes from a set of discourses that constitute us, that make us what we are, that help us think of what we are. Let me give you a related example which will help you understand this rather difficult philosophical problem. Suppose I were to say that was a major earthquake. The question you will ask is, how exactly was it major? My answer would be, all right, 10,000 people died, 2 cities were destroyed. Now you see, the minute I say major earthquake within quotes, or I tell you, oh my God, it was a major earthquake, you have an idea of what might happen because the word major indicates something to you. If you didn't have an idea of that, you would not understand the impact of an earthquake. That is, the frame determines the meaning. Unless we have a notion of a major earthquake, unless we know what disaster means, you will not understand what has happened. The frame precedes the meaning. In other words, without the language of disaster, without the frame of disaster, the event will not make sense. What happens in a particular accident makes sense because there is a language in which it is described for and to us. Otherwise, it makes no sense. In other words, what postmodernism talks about is all events, good, bad, horrible, pleasant, pleasurable, make sense to us because there is a set of discourses that have been circulating about those events. This means I am who I am because anatomy describes me in a certain way. The psychologist describes me in a certain way. Religion describes me in a certain way. If I didn't have those descriptions, I do not know who or what I am. Now, this does not mean that there is no real. Please understand this argument. It does not mean there is no real. But for us to interpret the real, for us to understand the real, we need a language. We need a set of discourses. That is postmodernism, which believes that all issues of the real, all nature and conditions of the real are available to us because there is a language in which we talk about it. Postmodern arts and culture, which is module 5. What postmodern arts and culture does is to mix all sorts of styles. High culture combines with low cultural forms, supposedly. There is the use of the vernacular in high cultural forms. What do we mean by high culture? Art galleries, Satyajit Ray films and art films made for film festivals, the opera. These are all high culture forms. Then there is a pop culture forms, which is street theatre, popular masala films as we call them in India. What are these? These are supposedly mass culture, as in things that everybody enjoys, as opposed to high culture, which is restricted to a small section of the society. Now, what postmodern arts do is to mix these two. The recycling of traditional songs, the use of folk and country music, the use of older art forms into contemporary versions. Think of the ways in which rock music has evolved. It starts off as a rebellion, as a resistance to high cultural forms like the opera. Take the example of punk, which also starts off as youth rebellion and then becomes something else. So, what postmodernism believes is that the distinction between elite or high culture and low culture is something that has been deliberately created. High culture belongs to the upper classes, low culture belongs to the masses, and they should not come together. Mass culture is treated as something which has no taste, which has no aesthetic sense, and which has no value. But you see, the point is precisely this. Somebody as now canonical and classical as Shakespeare was actually a person who catered to the masses. 400 people paid money to watch his plays. He was the biggest mass entertainer of his time. He was not meant for the elite alone. This is important to understand. What we are talking about is high culture and low culture. The distinction is something that reinforces class distinctions in any society. Or there are certain people who only see art films. When we say that, what do we mean? We mean that there is a small group of people, quote unquote intellectuals, who only see art films. But you see, the vast majority of people like you and me see Batman and Karan Johar films, right? Now, this distinction between high culture and low culture, therefore, is actually the distinction between classes that is imposed, and that also implies that culture has a role to play in the way society is organized. Postmodernism resists this. Postmodernism makes it problematic for people to say, oh, I only do high culture. Because the minute you say that, you are talking about a structural condition in society, right? So, when we talk about high culture, we should be aware immediately of this class distinction. There is one more thing I want to speak about here. Postmodern culture also has ready-made signs for everything. Think of the smileys and the emoticons on your email or your SMS. Think of the kinds of things you hear when you pick up a phone and call a service agent. Your call is important to us. Have a good day. I hope you are doing well. Now, you see, they don't mean any of it. It is not something which is significant, yet they say it. What has happened is that phrase, your call is important to us, or we wish you a good day, has been emptied of its meaning. Postmodernism is the changed nature of old-fashioned phrases. It's the changed nature of meaning itself, that when somebody says in their email, they sign off with the word love. Does it mean they really love you? They don't. But it is used now as a shorthand for something else. The intrinsic value of a word or a concept has now been emptied, and it makes very little sense now. Postmodernism, therefore, is the shift of connotation, is a shift of meaning from one to the next. My last module is on postmodernism in literature, which is arguably the biggest genre now. Postmodernism in literature combines various things. It combines reality with the unreal. For example, where Salim Sinai in Salman Rushdie's famous Midnight Children says, the wars happened, the India wars happened because he dreamed about them. Now the question is, how does dreaming about something make it real? Postmodernism mixes up the real with the unreal. Postmodernism brings back magic, superstition, myth into contemporary life. Postmodern literature also brings back historical figures. For example, in Milan Kundera's novel Immortality, two of the characters are Wolfgang Goethe, the German writer and philosopher, and Ernest Hemingway, the American author. And in a strange story, these two authors are living in the present. Now we know that they are not alive. We know that there cannot be a novel about the contemporary which involves Goethe and Hemingway. But the mix and match thing where history and the present merge is a characteristic postmodern feature. In fact, that's why postmodern literature is often referred to as metafiction. And metafiction requires some little definition. Metafiction is fiction which talks about itself as to how it has been composed. A fine example of metafiction would be Italo Calvino's novel, If on a Winter's Night a Traveller. If on a Winter's Night a Traveller opens with a set of instructions on how to read the novel. It tells us you are about to read a novel called If on a Winter's Night a Traveller by Italo Calvino. Now this statement is not an instruction in itself, it's an instruction that is a part of the novel. Metafiction is a traditional postmodern feature whereby the novel talks about the art of the novel itself. Postmodern literature also is full of play and games. Tristram Shandy has already been mentioned. When you look at Salman Rushdie or Mukul Keshavan's fiction, songs from Hindi films, newspaper reports are all merged with the story. Now you will say, okay, that's not a novel, that's not how a novel should read. But you see, that's the whole point. Postmodernism believes that these forms cannot be kept separate. That here is the novel, here is poster, here is the novel, here is the film song. Rushdie puts them all together, Mukul Keshavan puts them all together. What postmodernism does is to break down the boundaries of form. break down the boundaries of genre, which is what I refer to as its playfulness. It becomes impossible to see where the novel's fictional component ends and historical reality begins. It becomes impossible to see whether the film, the song, the poster, the advertisement is a part of the novel or it has just been thrown in. So, this mixing of genres is an intrinsic feature of the postmodern. Now, what does this imply? It implies that postmodernism does not respect purity. It does not accept truth. Remember, we began with this, that postmodernism is one that does not believe anything is complete in itself. A novel is not complete because a novel also refers to advertising and packaging and brands and film songs. There is no such thing as a pure discipline. Now, let me just quickly reiterate this before we wind up the session for the day. Postmodernism is a philosophical, critical approach that does not respect universal categories like truth. It does not accept totalizing narratives which says this explains everything. It believes in partial knowledge, incomplete and fragmentary knowledge. It believes that genres are mixed, matched, borrowed and adapted. It believes in open texts. It believes also that because we are human and limited, our knowledge will also therefore always be limited. It also argues a case that when we look at the real, we are looking at the real mediated by discourses. I understand myself, I understand the world because there are discourses that help me understand it. Therefore, the real is what gets constructed through language and discourse. Finally, postmodernism's sense of play manifests in its emphasis on signs and sign value like the hyperreal, that we do not bother with the original anymore because we are happy with the copy itself. The copy is our original. Thank you.